All right. Hello, HHT community, and welcome to our latest webinar. Today, you will have the opportunity to learn all about the groundbreaking Pazopanib clinical trial. And I do have to say, this webinar has also set a new Cure HHT record with over 450 registrants. So thank you all for the engagement. My name is Riley Blevins. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Cure HHT, and I'll be moderating tonight's session. Before we jump in, I first want to make some announcements on important news. First, we're excited to announce the date and location of our next National HHT Patient and Physician Conference. It will take place just outside Philadelphia on April 6th through the 7th. Registration details will be provided in the coming weeks, but please do save that date. Simply put, there's no better way to ensure you're up to date on the latest in HHT research, treatment, and care than by attending one of our conferences. Also, we are excited to share our 15th HHT International Scientific Conference will be held at the Pullman Mandalou Bay in Mandalou-la-Napoule, France on October 15th through the 19th, 2024. This conference is one of the more meaningful ways we advance treatment and care within HHT. It fuels innovation and sparks collaboration amongst the world's leading physicians, researchers, and scientists. Next, as you will hear more about today, participating in research is one of the most meaningful ways you can contribute to a brighter future for our disease and its patients. We have several research projects underway, and you can learn more about things like the Brain Vascular Malformation Consortium and tissue donation by visiting the research section of our website. Also, as many listening here are very well aware, a diagnosis can save a life. Check out the resource library for our new genetics brochure. There's one for physicians and one for patients. Please share these with your family and local doctors. HHT is a not so rare disease, so you simply never know. Finally, before we officially get underway, I want to go over some housekeeping rules for the webinar to make this event as interactive as possible. If you have a question for a presenter tonight, please type it into the Q&A box to the right of your screen. We recommend that you keep your questions general in nature so they benefit everyone. I will ask as many questions as time allows. I will also post resources relevant to tonight's topic in the chat box. You can use the chat to make comments to either an individual or to all participants on the webinar, but please do not post questions for the presenters in the chat box. Again, all questions should be typed into the Q&A box. This presentation is being recorded, and that recording will be saved in the Cure HHT website's resource library. And at the end of the discussion, you will be emailed a brief survey. Your input is so critical for the development of future webinars and resources, so please do take a few minutes to give us your feedback. And with that, let's get going. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Cassi Friday is the Director of Research Programs and Grants for Cure HHT. She joined our team after completing her PhD from the University of Kentucky. Cassi is also a caregiver for her husband and 2 of their 3 children who have HHT. With us tonight, we also have Dr. James Gossage, who is the Director of the HHT Center of Excellence at Augusta University. Dr. Gossage is also the Principal Investigator for the Pazopanib clinical trial. At the end of their presentations, we will hold a 30-minute moderated Q&A session. And with that, Cassi, I will turn things over to you.
All right. Can see the screen okay? All right, excellent. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in with us on your Friday and for watching this later if you're catching the recording in our resource library. Like Riley said, my name is Cassi, and as the Director of Research for Cure HHT, I have the great privilege of overseeing the sponsorship of this clinical trial by our organization. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why we're sponsoring this clinical trial and exactly what that means, because it's definitely not typical for a patient advocacy organization like Cure HHT to sponsor a phase 2-3 FDA registration clinical trial like the one that you'll be learning about tonight. And so to get to the history of how we got in this position, we're going to go back in time a little bit, about 8 years or so, to 2015, when Pazopanib, its form in a 200 milligram tablet, has the trade name of Votrient. And this drug was owned by GSK, which is a large pharmaceutical company. And its actual indication is for treating kidney cancer. And so in 2015, we started the first clinical trial for HHT-related bleeding using a low dose of Pazopanib. And you may be wondering, why use a cancer therapeutic for patients who have HHT? And that actually goes back a little bit further in time, where there was an HHT patient who had cancer and was taking one of these classes of drugs called an anti-angiogenic. And so in the course of their cancer treatment, they noticed a significant improvement in their HHT-related bleeding. And so this really prompted clinicians and researchers to consider this class of drugs as a possible potential therapy for patients who have HHT at a lower dose than what would be given in a cancer therapy regimen. And so our 2015 HHT trial using Pazopanib was sponsored by GSK, and the principal investigator for that trial was Dr. Marie Faunin. And unfortunately, that year, GSK sold its oncology portfolio to another pharmaceutical company, Novartis. And at that time, they weren't interested in continuing any clinical trials for off-label use of Votrient. So meaning that they didn't want to proceed with programs that weren't for its normal indication of cancer therapy. And so unfortunately, at that time, the clinical trial was closed, and the results were published from the 7 participants who were in the trial at that time. And Dr. Gossage will talk about that a little bit later. But unfortunately, that kind of ended our access to Votrient, or that 200 milligram version of Pazopanib. And so CureHHT made the decision to invest in manufacturing a lower dose of Pazopanib. So you can take that same compound and basically just give it a new delivery package. So taking a lower dose of it, 25 milligrams, and kind of creating a new tablet to surround it, and doing all the testing, which we call PK and PD testing, to see if we could put this into a clinical trial and continue investigating the use of this investigational drug product as a treatment for HHT. So here's your little cheat sheet for what PK/PD testing is. So also why it's very important. Pharmacokinetic testing is all about what the body does to the drug. So are you absorbing the drug well? Is it going to the right places in the body, being metabolized, and is it being excreted instead of stored and built up somewhere? And then you have the flip side, which is called pharmacodynamics. And that's really what the drug does to the body. Is it working on the pathway that you want it to work on? Is like the affinity or the attraction of that drug with its target working okay? What dose is needed to achieve a good effect of or your desired effect? And then how often do you need to have that dose to maintain that desired effect? And so this process is pretty extensive, as you can imagine, and it takes a long time. And you want it to be thorough, trust me, to make sure that things are safe and effective to put into a clinical trial. And so after 6 years, over $500,000, and with a lot of help, we were able to gather enough data for the safety and the effectiveness to put this new drug compound into a clinical trial. And along the way, we had a lot of talks with the FDA to make sure that they were hearing the patient voice and the urgency to develop a therapy that's approved for HHT patients. And so they actually were able to grant us a breakthrough therapy designation for the use of this investigational product in the clinical trial. And that just gives us sort of the ability, if the trial is positive, to expedite the review process of a new drug application to get approval for Pazopanib in the use of HHT-related bleeding. And then we also were awarded a $5 million grant from the Department of Defense. And then the FDA awarded us almost another $1 million more, which was very exciting. So now we had the money to actually execute this clinical trial. But of course, we needed to find the expertise. All of this happened during COVID. So on top of the really long time it took to do manufacturing and all of that extensive testing, we were delayed again with finding all of our vendors and the people to help us who have that expertise in launching a clinical trial. But we've gathered the whole team, and finally in 2023, here we are, and we are recruiting. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Gossage, and he's going to tell you more about what this study entails, who might be eligible to participate, and also what you need to do if you're interested in possibly participating in this clinical trial. And then Dr. Gossage, if you want to unmute, I can keep my screen share on and click through slides for you.
Okay. Can people hear and see me?
All good?
All right, good evening. And can you see my arrow moving around?
I cannot.
Okay. All right. So good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar. I hope it'll be very successful. I wanted to just start out by saying that the study sponsor for this, besides the FDA and the DoD, is Cure HHT. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Dr. Dennis Sprecher, who is a cardiologist, used to work for GSK, but now has really devoted the last 5 or 6 years to bringing the study up. And he's really the brains behind this study. I'm just the guy who has his name on the grant, but he's the brains behind it. Next slide. All right, so what is Pazopanib? Cassie told you a little bit about this. It's an oral medication currently FDA approved for the treatment of certain cancers like renal cancer. Now, for the current study, the current HHT study, it's considered an experimental drug. So it's FDA approved for cancer and it's experimental for HHT. One important point is that the usual dose for cancer is 800 milligrams, but the dose for HHT is 150, 200 milligrams, and for this study is 150 milligrams, which is 1/5 of the cancer dose. So we're hopeful that it will mean less side effects for HHT patients. I don't want to talk too much about the mechanism of action, in other words, how this might do its thing, but it involves the inhibition or the blockage of certain proteins and enzymes called tyrosine kinases, including VEGF, VEGFR2, which are believed to be involved in the development of AVMs in HHT. And I don't know, Courtney, if you're able to change where that chat box appears, but every now and then it's right in the middle of the text that I'm looking at, and probably other people are looking at. Okay, so that's how it works. And we think that by inhibiting those enzymes, it will at least block the production of more AVMs and perhaps even cause regression of AVMs. We have some evidence for that. So in terms of the research work that's already been done before this study and really is the foundation for this study, Dr. Friday already mentioned the 7-patient trial by Dr. Fawnin. We were a part of that study. And this was published in, go back, please. This was published in 2019 and looked at the low dose 50 milligrams of Pazopanib. This was done in 7 patients who had HHT-related bleeding. Could be nosebleeds, could be intestinal bleeding, or could be both. And all 7 patients showed at least some improvement in nosebleeds or anemia or both. And so these were encouraging results, and we were very disappointed that Novartis did not want to continue the study. Next slide. And so then in 2022, Dr. Paramble, who is actually the co-principal investigator with myself on this current research study, published a report of 13 patients. This is a retrospective report. And what retrospective means is that the patients get the treatment, and then at some point after they've gotten the treatment, we actually go back and look at the data. It's kind of a retro look, a retrospective look at the data. And these were all patients who had pretty bad bleeding, either intestinal or nose bleeding, but importantly, they were dependent on blood transfusions because their bleeding was so bad. All 13 patients showed an improvement in their nosebleeds, in their hemoglobin levels, and in their blood transfusion needs. Next slide. And then most recently, Aluwalia and colleagues from Mayo Clinic presented a poster at our last scientific conference. So this is an oral presentation only. It's not yet been published as far as I'm aware, which was another retrospective study of 15 patients that were treated at their institution for refractory bleeding. And they found that 10 patients had a good or excellent response in terms of improved nosebleeds, anemia, or decreased transfusion need. Next slide. So that brings us to the current study that we're talking about today. And this is a little bit of a complicated slide that goes over the overall schema for this study. And is that something that I can control? No. Okay. So this study involves 2 in-person visits. The lower left-hand side is the screen or enrollment visit. Yeah, that's it. And so this is where you would go into the site. You would review the information. You would sign the consent form. You would get some blood tests, an EKG, and some other tests. And then if you qualify, you would start the study. And then either right then and there or within 4 weeks later, you would begin what we call the run-in period, which you see as the next segment there. And that's at least 6 weeks, but could be as long as 12 weeks. And this is the period in which we try to determine if your nosebleeds are stable and get a good idea of exactly how severe your nosebleeds are. We'll be checking blood work every 3 weeks, and you'll be entering nosebleed data into an app, iPhone or an Android phone, every day to give us an idea of exactly what your nosebleeds are like. And if after 6 weeks, at least 6 weeks, if everything checks out, you would be randomized. And what that means is you're randomized to either Pazopanib, 150 milligrams a day, or placebo, which looks just like the Pazopanib, but there's no actual active drug. It's kind of like a sugar pill, is another name for it. And this is 50-50. So half the patients will get placebo, half the patients will get Pazopanib. The doctor won't know what you're getting. You won't know what you're getting. And it has to be done this way in order to give us an honest measure of the effectiveness of the medication, which is one of the main reasons for the study. In other words, we already have these retrospective studies that suggest there's a benefit, but there's a lot of bias and things like that that can creep into these kinds of studies. So this is going to be kind of our true test to say whether what we've seen in the retrospective studies is actually an honest evaluation. And additionally, we also want to see, is it safe? We think it's safe. And what we've seen so far, it looks safe. But again, this is going to be an honest test of how safe it is. So then we see day 1 there. That's when you start drug. You take 6 pills a day, 150 milligrams. And then that would be the 24 weeks of the Part B section of the study. And every 3 weeks, you'll have a visit virtually. You'll take your pills all the way along. And then after 24 weeks, we have the rollover visit, which is the second in-person visit where you would actually go to the research site, such as Augusta University or Yale, and have some more tests, more questionnaires, and that would potentially be the end of the study if you wanted it to be. If you wanted to continue in the study, then you could roll over to the Part C extension study. And in that phase of the study, everybody gets the real drug. And that goes on for another 24 weeks. At the end of the 24 weeks, at least the taking the drug part of the study is over. And then it's followed by 12 weeks of follow-up, where we just kind of see if you had a response, what happens to that response over time. Now, so if you end up getting the real drug from the beginning, you might get it for almost as long as a year. Whereas if you got the placebo for the first half, then you get placebo for 6 months and then study drug for 6 months. But everybody gets drug for the last half of the study, at least, if you stay in it that long. Next slide. All right, so how are we going to define success of the study drug? This is what we call the primary endpoint of the study. For the comparison, we're going to look at the number of people in the Pazopanib group, in other words, the people who, and we're talking about the first 24-week part of the study. So we're going to look at the number of people in the Pazopanib group versus the placebo group who have either a 2-point increase in their hemoglobin or a 50% decrease in the duration of nosebleeds. So if we look at that lower left-hand graph, this is just an example of what a successful primary endpoint might look like. So let's say at baseline, your hemoglobin is 10.5. And then assuming you get drug and just gradually over time, it increases until at week 24, it's, let's say 12.5, 12.6. That would be a successful hemoglobin endpoint. That would be successful for the drug. Now, of course, if you got placebo, that would also be successful. And we're hoping that we see a lot more successful endpoints with the drug than we do with the placebo. And in the case of the nose bleeding, which would be the right-hand graph, let's say at baseline, you've got about 60 minutes of nosebleeds a week. That'd be like a 10-minute nosebleed every day. And then over time, they gradually improve until at week 24, you're down to about 20, 25 minutes. That would be at least a 50% decrease, and that would be a positive endpoint. That's what we're hoping for, that we will show more patients on drug have this positive effect than people who get the placebo. Next slide. All right, so I'm sure many of you are wondering, well, is this study for me? So who can join this study? And these are what we call the inclusion criteria. And these are not a full list, but just some of the key ones. You've got to be between age 18 and 80 as a start. And we're actually considering increasing that to age 85, but that has not been fully decided. And it would be at least a couple of months before that would take effect, if we ever do make it take effect. You've got to have definite or probable diagnosis of HHT. So we want your doctor to be sure or pretty sure that you've got HHT. If it's kind of an iffy diagnosis, then you wouldn't be eligible for the study. You have to have at least 20 minutes of nosebleeds a week and an average hemoglobin that's less than 11 points. So let's say you've got bad nosebleeds. You're bleeding an hour or two a week, but you've got a great bone marrow and your hemoglobin is 13, 14. You unfortunately would not be eligible for the study if that was the case. Or your nosebleeds are just a couple minutes a week, but you've got a really severe anemia, hemoglobin of 8 or 9, mostly because of intestinal bleeding. You also would not be eligible. Now, it's okay to have intestinal bleeding, but you've got to have at least 20 minutes of nosebleeds a week. This study is not what I say for the faint of heart. We ask a lot of the patients. There's going to be a lot of virtual visits, blood tests. You've got to be able to complete daily blood pressure measurements, and we're going to send you home with a little automatic blood pressure cuff. And you've got to be able to monitor your nosebleeds and enter them in an app every day. An important one is you have to be willing to forego other treatments while you're in this study, such as a laser or starting new drug treatments like Avastin or tranexamic acid. Now, it's okay if you're on certain treatments to begin with, like doxycycline or tranexamic acid nose drops. If you're on them to begin with, it's okay, but you can't start them once the study starts. And additionally, you can't have any kind of cauteries on your nose after the study starts. Well, I should say you can have cautery, but if you do, you will have to be removed from the study. Women of childbearing potential have to use birth control. This drug, just like Avastin, would be extremely harmful to embryos. So you just cannot get pregnant on this study. And if you are of childbearing potential, we'll be monitoring your pregnancy test every 3 weeks throughout the study. Next slide. Then we have the list of what we call exclusion criteria, and these are things that prevent you from entering the study. In other words, if you have these, you can't join. So poorly controlled high blood pressure would be one of them. It's okay if you have high blood pressure as long as it's controlled. And even if it gets a little bit out of control during the study, it's okay as long as we're able to adjust your medicines and get it back under control. There are certain medications that can't be taken if you're in the study, like simvastatin. Now, if you're on simvastatin, you can potentially still enroll in the study as long as we take you off of the simvastatin and get you on something else to take over for that medicine. You cannot be on other medications, what we call VEGF inhibitors, in the past 4 to 6 weeks, like Avastin or pomalidomide. It's okay if you've been on them in the past, but you'll have to come off them for at least 4 to 6 weeks before the study starts if you want to be in the study. Other things like incompletely treated brain AVMs or lung AVMs. You can't have had a malignancy in the past 5 years, although most types of skin cancer are okay. But if you've got colon cancer in the last 5 years, then you wouldn't be eligible. A problem would be planned surgery during the study. It's okay to have surgery before the study or after the study. But if you've got a hip surgery, for instance, scheduled for 3 months from now, you would not be eligible for the study. And the main reason is that medications like Pazopanib and Avastin inhibit wound healing. That's one of the ways that they work in HHT, is by inhibiting blood vessel growth, and blood vessels are important for wound healing. So you would either have to postpone that surgery or have the surgery and then enroll in this study at a later time. And then certain types of heart disease or recent blood clots, like strokes or blood clots in your legs, would be exclusionary. And that's just for the last 6 months for the blood clots. All right. So what do we expect of you guys if you enroll in this study? We already mentioned the 2 in-person visits, one at the beginning and one on the rollover between the randomized study and the drug-only study. And then in between, there's going to be virtual visits every 3 weeks, 22 total. And that would include both the run-in period, the randomized portion, the non-randomized portion, and the follow-up. And these typically would be 15, 20-minute phone calls with the study coordinator, where they would check to see how you're feeling, any side effects, have you had any recent iron infusions and things like that, any new medications that you're taking. Not very involved. You take your study drug every day, very important. You have to record your blood pressure and nosebleeds every day, and this is super important. The blood pressure is because drugs like Avastin and Pazopanib can cause high blood pressure. And so if it's affecting you that way, we want to know early on so we can get you on additional treatment if necessary. And of course, nosebleeds, that's part of our primary endpoint. And we've got to have very accurate recordings of your nosebleeds. How often, how long they last, things like that. It's not that involved. It's 7 or 8 questions for each nosebleed. It really takes no more than a minute to do. Of course, if you have no nosebleeds that day, it's very quick. Every 3 weeks, you'll fill out some electronic questionnaires, such as how you're feeling overall, how the nosebleeds in general are doing, do you have fatigue, things like that. Really a couple of minutes per questionnaire. Probably the biggest thing would be to get your blood and urine tested every 3 weeks, just to see how's your hemoglobin doing, how are your iron levels doing, are there any side effects from this medication? Is it affecting your protein in your urine or something like that? And then we're going to send you home with a snazzy little EKG device that just straps around your chest. And 6 weeks after you start the drug, you'll take an EKG, and if it looks good, you're fine. If there are concerns, then we might ask you to check it every 6 weeks after that. So at least once, but maybe every 6 weeks. Next slide. So what are the most common risks of Pazopanib? We already mentioned increased blood pressure. And it can almost always be well controlled with medication if need be. A weird one is it can affect the liver. And so the liver might release enzymes into the blood that we can detect with the blood work. We see that in about 10 to 15% of patients who get the cancer dose. We expect it to be a lot less. We really haven't seen it so far with lower doses, but we'll be monitoring that closely in the study. There could be changes to the heart rhythm. There can be infections. Uncommon, but possible. Gastrointestinal symptoms like diarrhea can occur, low energy, protein in the urine. So we'll be monitoring all these with the blood work and with our phone calls every 3 weeks. Next slide. So will the study cost me anything? Basically, no. The study drug, the lab tests, these will all be provided for free. The travel expenses to and from the research site, those 2 visits will be covered partially, and Cassi, I believe, we'll talk about that. The blood pressure cuff and EKG device will be given to you, but have to be returned at the end of the study. That's basically it. So I think I'll turn this over next to Cassi. We'll talk about travel reimbursement and where the study is occurring.
Yep, thank you. So I have listed here kind of the travel reimbursement schedule for the set amount of distance traveled for visiting the participating center that you would enroll in. So if you're less than 200 miles away from a participating or recruiting center, it's a $60 travel reimbursement. And then that increases with the increase in distance that you would need to travel. And again, this information can be found on our website, and you should be getting links to all of that information in the chat and then after this webinar. And also, as we go through here, we have enrollment ongoing. There will be at least 12 sites in the United States and the United States only enrolling for this clinical trial. And so you can see highlighted in green are the sites that are activated and currently enrolling. And then the ones in this dark blue are ones that are coming soon. And what that means by coming soon is just that they're getting all the ducks in a row, so to speak. So in order to successfully start enrolling for this study at their site, they need to have their institution's regulatory approvals. They need to be trained. They need to get all the study materials sent to them, like those blood pressure cuffs and lab kits that you as a participant would be sent home with. And so we still have 5 sites that are coming on board, and Cure HHT will be announcing kind of on a rolling basis when those sites are activated. So if you for instance, you live in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Cleveland Clinic is the closest site to you, we can let you know as soon as they are online and ready to receive patients. But you can always please go ahead and contact them. So the next steps, if you're interested in participating in the study or you want to learn more, is to contact us at research@curehht.org or reach out to the study that's closest to you. So I have listed here the 7 sites that are already active and enrolling participants for this study. And we hope to close recruitment early, as always, but Right now, we have this set to be recruiting all the way into the fall of next year. And so you can find that information here. And even if you think that you may not be eligible for this study, or you're not really sure because maybe your hemoglobin fluctuates, please go ahead and reach out, because it will ultimately be up to the medical professionals at each one of these recruiting sites to determine your eligibility to participate. So don't discount something that you're not sure of. If you're interested, please go ahead and reach out and see if you would be eligible. So now we're going to open it up for question and answer time. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that we can look at some of the different questions in our chat box and get those answered.
All right. Thank you, Doctors Friday and Gossage. Really appreciate that thorough overview. But again, beginning our Q&A portion now. So please do take advantage of these experts being here. We'll get to as many questions as we have time for here today. All right, we'll start it off. We're getting a lot of questions related to Avastin here. So I'm going to try to lump a few of these together. Dr. Gossage, I'll throw this one to you. How is Pazopanib different than Avastin? And secondly, since Avastin is an option right now for HHT patients, why is it important to have a multitude of options or something like Pazopanib as well?
Sure. So Avastin is an antibody directed against VEGF, which is one of the main proteins that we think is involved in causing AVMs, which cause bleeding, obviously. Pazopanib is also directed against this VEGF, but gets a number of other what we call tyrosine kinases. So we think it may actually inhibit more points in the development of the AVM. But again, that's what the study is to find out. Also, it's a pill as opposed to an infusion. So that could be better for a lot of patients. One of the problems we've seen with Avastin is that since you get intermittent infusions, we see some people who they get their infusion, they do great, their hemoglobin's 14, 15, and then at some point, a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months later, boom, it drops like a rock, and it's 8 or 9. They get another infusion. So there can be this yo-yo going on with your hemoglobin level. Whereas the Pazopanib, you take it every day. And so we haven't really seen that in patients who've taken the Pazopanib so far. And then I guess getting to the second question is why should we be interested in this since we already have Avastin out there? Well, Avastin doesn't work in everybody, number one. In my experience, it doesn't work or it has substantial side effects in 20 to 30% of patients. So we need other drugs. And additionally, some patients' insurance just won't cover Avastin. So it's always better to have more options for patients.
Sounds good. Thank you for that, Dr. Gossage. Have another one here for you as well. This was touched on briefly during the presentation, but just want to reiterate it because we have seen a few questions come across. And that is, will this drug also impact GI bleeding in addition to nose bleeding? And we've also gotten some questions related to liver AVM and the drug's potential impact on those.
So definitely, it seems to benefit both nosebleeds and intestinal bleeds in a pretty good fashion, at least in the early studies. We're not sure about liver AVMs. We don't really have any published data on liver AVMs yet in Pazopanib, but a small part of the study that we're doing will be to look at liver AVMs, but it's not a primary endpoint. So we might learn some information that would suggest it's beneficial or not beneficial, but it certainly would not allow it to be approved for liver AVM. We wouldn't think. Someone also I saw in the chat asked about lung AVMs, and we haven't seen any drugs that help lung AVM so far, including Avastin. So I would be surprised if this helped lung AVMs.
Which is, again, why it's really important to continue with research and trying, participating in other clinical trials and looking at different avenues, because we have a variety of symptoms and manifestations with HHT, so you need a variety of tools in the toolbox to treat them. And hopefully Pazopanib can be one of them, along with Avastin, and maybe a future unknown something for pulmonary involvement.
Well said. The next one, Cassie, I think I'll send over your way, which is, why can't I participate at my local center? And additionally, for example, why can't I do things like check-ins with a local hematologist?
Right. So what's really important about a clinical trial is how regimented it is, and how well regulated, so that we can make sure that every single part of the study is well controlled. And so, we have this open to a number of different sites. And in thinking about which sites to bring on, we were trying to be mindful about geographic dispersal across the country to allow better access for patients who may live in Texas or California or New York, so they wouldn't have to travel too far. But you can't just go to your regular physician to participate in this trial, because they don't have the resources and the clinical monitoring that's necessary to ensure everything is consistent across the board between you and any of the other participants in the study, and the treatment and care and resources that you need. And the reason that we can't just make that universal across the country is because every one of these sites that are added on is a pretty good amount of money, and the money only goes so far. So we do as best as we can with the sites that we have, and we try to space them out and then provide travel reimbursements to help sort of ease that burden and getting somewhere if your local center or your local physician can't provide you access.
Thank you for that.
Now, I guess if somebody out there wants to donate $100,000 to
Yeah.
HHT and say, hey, let's open up Barking Pumpkin, Georgia as a site, that would be fine.
Year-end appeal is right around the corner, so now's the time, if there are any takers out there. Moving this along, we're getting a lot of questions related to, can I continue to receive iron infusions or even something like Avastin during the trial?
So iron infusions, definitely. And we're going to monitor your iron very closely. And we want to try to keep the iron infusions consistent. So our hope would be that if you're on iron infusions in the beginning, that as you get better, you come off iron infusions. That's what we've seen in the preliminary data. But we'll be monitoring that. We'll give you iron if you need it. We won't give it to you if you don't need it. Avastin, no Avastin, because these drugs are too similar in their targets, their mechanisms, and we have no experience in what giving both Avastin and Pazopanib would do to the body. It could be a bad thing to give both of them. So at least at this point, we need to test just the one drug.
All right, next question, Cassie, I'm going to send over to you, and that is, are there patients on this drug outside of the trial?
Yes. So the retrospective studies that Dr. Gossage talked about when going through some of the previous results of people taking Pazopanib, those retrospective studies were done using data from patients who were not enrolled in a clinical trial. They had been taking this therapeutic, what we call off-label, or not for its normal indicated use of abdominal cancer. And so then we can look at those patients and look back historically to see how well they did and aggregate that data and publish it and use that as evidence. But really what we need is a prospective study. So looking forward, we're enrolling people with intention, with the same set of criteria across the board, and looking for certain endpoints to get to in the future. And that makes things really controlled and makes the data really reliable. But yes, there are still people taking Pazopanib outside of the clinical trial, but it may be harder to access and harder to get insurance to pay for as well.
Thanks, Cassie. All right, Dr. Gossage, I think I have one for you as well. Not sure how in depth you want to get to this topic, but we're getting a lot of questions about comparing Pazopanib in terms of safety, efficacy to things like Avastin and even pomalidomide.
All right, so let's start with Avastin first. We've got a lot of experience with Avastin. It is a pretty successful drug. As I said, I believe 70 to 80% successful. And it improves nosebleeds, GI bleeds, hemoglobin level, anemia. It does have some side effects. It's typically not severe. There can be some severe ones, but in general, I feel like maybe 10, 15% of patients need to come off of Avastin because of side effects. High blood pressure, protein in the urine, things like that. Those have been the ones I've seen mostly so far. So Pazopanib at least has looked good in the preliminary studies, but in terms of effectiveness versus Avastin, the only way we would know that for sure is if we compared them head to head. So I did a research study where instead of placebo, it was Pazopanib versus Avastin. And maybe we'll have one of those one of these days. We may get some hints at it. I mean, if this is like a blockbuster and it just knocks it out of the park and everybody gets better, well, then that might suggest it's better than Avastin. But still, we need a head-to-head comparison to know for sure. In terms of side effects, our hope would be that this would be better tolerated because although these are both cancer drugs and they have a generally similar profile of side effects like proteinuria and high blood pressure, it tends to be dose related. So our suspicion is that since we're giving this at about 1/5 of the cancer dose, that we would see this less commonly. So maybe better tolerated. But we got to do the study to know the answer. Did that answer the question, Riley?
Yeah, I think you did a great job. So thank you for that. Next up, and I might pose this to you both, not sure who wants to jump in here first, but what happens if this trial is successful and positive? And to add on to that, more simply, why is it so important to get FDA approval in the first place?
I think that this is successful and positive. We have a lot more work to do, which is a good thing. If you have positive results in the trial after all of the data analysis is done, then we approach the FDA again with something called an NDA or a new drug application, and we begin talks to try to get this approved for use of HHT related bleeding. So instead of Pazopanib just being indicated for abdominal cancers, now the low dose form of Pazopanib, as we have studied it, can be approved for the use of patients with HHT. And there's a piece of legislation that just got introduced 2 weeks ago that is basically urging Medicare and Medicaid to use peer-reviewed data and clinical guidelines to expand access for rare disease patients to drugs for off-label use. But private payers and private insurance companies really have no, the government really can't force them into accepting these off-label uses for an affordable price for patients to access. And so getting FDA approval makes that process easier and these products more accessible to a broader range of people.
Thank you, Cassie.
If you had anything to add, go for it.
Very good. I agree.
Sounds good. We have just a few minutes left here, so if you haven't gotten your questions in, I encourage you to do so and take advantage of the experts we have here today. As a next question, we are seeing a lot of questions from places like the UK and Canada wondering about international implications for this study and access to the drug.
So, unclear. This study has been designed with the FDA in mind, who approve drugs in the United States. And if it's a successful study, we would first try to get approval in the United States. I would assume that we would try to get approval in other countries, but I have no expertise at all in the approval process for other countries. And at least in the United States, there are compassionate use programs sometimes for drugs. Whether they have those in other countries is less clear. For example, in the United States, a doctor can write a prescription for pretty much any drug that's FDA approved for some indication. And that's the off-label use that I think that Cassie mentioned earlier. But I'm not sure if that's possible in other countries. So what it would mean for other countries, a little bit unclear at this point.
Thank you for that. Our next one is an interesting one here, but that is the drug tend to be more effective for a certain HHT mutation, for example, HHT type 1 versus HHT type 2?
Unknown.
Yeah. We'll be collecting that data, hopefully, and hopefully we'll have a good distribution of participants in the trial who have HHT 1 or 2, and the data at the end may be able to show some trends related to that. But again, that's something that has not been studied yet, and you need quite a few people to make those kinds of considerations. So hopefully we'll know, but it may not shake out that way. Just depends on the numbers. But we're not specifically excluding anyone based on the type of HHT causing mutation that they have, or preferentially enrolling them based on the mutation.
And in the United States, it's about half and half HHT1 and HHT2, with a slight preference toward HHT1. So I would expect that there would be a good chance, if there's a significant difference, that we should be able to see that. If it's a very subtle difference, we might not be able to see that.
Thank you both. Cassie, I have a clarifying question for you here from one of our audience members, which is, you say Cure HHT is sponsoring this trial. What exactly does that mean?
Yes. So that means that we are ultimately responsible for the success, the failure, or anything that goes wrong within this clinical trial. We take all of the legal and financial responsibility for it. We maintain oversight of all of the vendors who are contracted to help in this clinical trial. And we're also sort of the pass-through to pay the bills from the grants that we've received to pay for the services of these vendors who are helping us execute this trial. That's probably the best and simplest way that I could put it. But that's typically what a pharmaceutical company does, is they're the ones who bring all the people together and sponsor or initiate and see through a clinical trial.
Riley, if I may chime in, unrelated to that, I noticed there's a couple things in the webinar chat. Can you be an antiplatelet and anticoagulant drugs in the study? Yes, you can. Those would not be exclusionary. Migraine medicines, I'm not sure. I think that would be okay. There's a fairly long list of medications that they're cautionary, but most of them are not common medicines at all. All the normal drugs are almost all of them are okay. And then one thing I just did want to just toss out there is that people have asked me this many times over the years, patients. Well, I like this idea. Sounds like a great study, but I don't want to be the guy to do it. I want other people. I want to let other people do the research. Well, yeah, I don't quite like that attitude. But if you take it even further, if everybody says that, there will never be any research. So somebody's got to do it. And especially since this is a hereditary condition, you're not only doing it for yourself, you're doing it for your family. And so this is your opportunity to help your family as many generations as may come afterwards. So it's really, research is important. Every drug, almost every drug that has been approved in the current times has gone through FDA approval and has had to have research studies, randomized controlled trials to approve them. So without the research, we would have absolutely no medications for you. So do research. Please help.
I think that's a perfect place to end things. Really appreciate those words, Dr. Gossage, and appreciate everybody who joined us here tonight. As you just heard, it really is true. Research is one of the most meaningful ways you can help create a brighter tomorrow for all the patients suffering from this disease. But on behalf of everybody here at Cure HHT, I want to thank everybody for attending tonight's webinar and for staying connected with us. We hope you've enjoyed tonight's program. And again, I wanted to thank Drs. Friday and Dr. Gossage for their time tonight. This program has been recorded and will be posted on our website for later viewing. Again, we appreciate your participation, and please remember to fill out that post-webinar survey linked in the chat. We truly do appreciate your feedback. Have a good evening, everybody.